On the night of February 4, 2016, an employee at the Central Bank of Bangladesh noticed something odd. The printer that normally spat out a continuous log of every international transaction request moving through the bank's systems had gone silent. Not broken exactly, just quiet, as if nothing had happened overnight. By the time anyone understood what that silence actually meant, attackers had already attempted to move nearly $1 billion out of Bangladesh Bank's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in what remains one of the largest attempted bank heists in world history, and one of the only ones ever carried out almost entirely through a keyboard. To understand this heist, you need to understand SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, the messaging network that essentially every major bank on the planet uses to instruct each other to move money internationally. When a bank wants to transfer funds to an account at another institution, it doesn't physically send anything. It sends an authenticated SWIFT message, effectively a secure, trusted instruction that says, move this amount from this account to this account. Because SWIFT messages are treated as authoritative by banks worldwide, gaining the ability to send them convincingly is close to the financial equivalent of getting your hands on a bank's own official letterhead and signature. Bangladesh Bank, the country's central bank, held an account with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, used to hold and move part of the country's foreign currency reserves. That account, and the SWIFT terminal used to issue instructions against it, became the target. Investigators later determined that attackers had been inside Bangladesh Bank's computer network for close to a year before the attempted theft. Conducting careful reconnaissance, they studied how the bank's staff actually used its SWIFT terminal, what times of day and week transfers were typically requested, and how the printer connected to the terminal. The same printer that would later go silent logged every transaction for staff to review. Using malware specifically built for this operation, the attackers eventually gained the ability to issue SWIFT messages using Bangladesh Bank's own legitimate credentials, while simultaneously suppressing the printed confirmation log and altering database records to delay anyone noticing the fraudulent transfers. They picked their moment carefully, a Thursday and Friday, which in Bangladesh falls on the weekend, meaning Bangladesh Bank's own offices would be closed and unable to respond quickly, while in New York it was still a regular business day at the Federal Reserve. On February 4 and 5, 2016, the attackers issued a flood of SWIFT transfer requests, instructing the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to move money out of Bangladesh Bank's account and into a series of accounts the attackers controlled, primarily at a bank in the Philippines. In total, the fraudulent instructions attempted to move approximately $951 million, nearly the entirety of the accessible balance in the account. The scale of that number tripped its own kind of alarm. Federal Reserve staff reviewing the unusually large batch of transfer requests grew suspicious of some of them and flagged several for manual review rather than processing them automatically, in part simply because the volume and destinations looked unusual for a central bank's typical activity. Most of the roughly $951 million in attempted transfers were blocked or held for review as a result. A combination of the Fed's own caution and, critically, one specific, almost accidental catch that would end up being the single most consequential detail of the entire heist. One of the fraudulent transfer instructions was routed through Deutsche Bank, which was acting as a correspondent bank in the chain. The payment instruction named the intended recipient as the Shalika Foundation, but the attackers had misspelled the word foundation, writing it instead as foundation. That single misspelled word was enough to trigger a manual review at Deutsche Bank. A routine anti-money laundering check flagged the transaction for the spelling discrepancy and sent a clarification request back toward Bangladesh Bank before allowing the transfer to proceed. That query effectively froze roughly $20 million tied to that specific transaction. And more importantly, it was one of several factors that helped surface the broader pattern of suspicious activity before more of the total sum could be released. The bulk of the roughly $850 million that ultimately wasn't stolen was blocked through a combination of the Fed's own suspicion of the unusual transfer pattern and the eventual, if delayed, discovery back in Bangladesh once staff returned to the office and found the disabled printer and altered records. But the misspelling is real. It is well documented in the subsequent investigation, and it remains one of the most widely cited details of the entire case. A reminder that sophisticated, patient state-level hacking operations can still be undone by a single careless spelling mistake in the final step. Despite the blocks and holds, 4 transfer requests did successfully clear, moving approximately $81 million into accounts at Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, a bank in the Philippines, along with a smaller amount, around $20 million, that was separately routed toward a foundation in Sri Lanka, though that Sri Lankan transfer was later recovered after the same kind of spelling irregularity and manual scrutiny caught it before the funds could be fully disbursed. The $81 million that reached the Philippines is where this story shifts from a technical intrusion into something closer to a heist film. Once the stolen funds landed in accounts at the Manila branch of Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, the money was moved quickly, in a sequence designed specifically to make it difficult to trace or recover. Philippine banking regulations at the time had specific carve-outs that made casinos a notably weak point for anti-money laundering oversight. Casino transactions were not subject to the same reporting requirements as standard bank transfers. The stolen funds were funneled into accounts, then withdrawn and converted into casino chips at several Manila casino resorts, run through gambling activity and cashed back out. A laundering technique that exploited a specific regulatory gap that Philippine lawmakers would move to close only after this case made the loophole nationally infamous. By the time investigators traced the funds through this casino laundering chain, the large majority of the $81 million had effectively vanished into cash, chips, and further transfers, much of it believed to have ultimately been moved out of the Philippines entirely through additional intermediaries. Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation faced serious regulatory consequences for its role, even though the bank itself was a victim of the same broader scheme rather than a participant. The Philippine Central Bank imposed what was, at the time, the largest fine it had ever levied against a bank, roughly $21 million for the anti-money laundering failures that allowed the stolen funds to move so easily through its branch. A branch manager at the bank was separately convicted on related charges. Over the following years, a combination of settlements, recovered funds, and casino-related legal actions clawed back a portion of the stolen $81 million, though a large share of the original theft was never recovered. In Bangladesh, the fallout reached the top of the central bank itself. The governor of Bangladesh Bank resigned within weeks of the incident becoming public, amid intense domestic political pressure over how such a significant breach of the country's foreign reserves had gone undetected for so long. Recovering the stolen $81 million turned into a legal saga that stretched on for years after the initial theft. Bangladesh Bank pursued civil litigation against Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation and several individuals connected to the laundering operation, seeking to recover the lost funds through the Philippine courts. In 2023, a Philippine court ordered the bank to pay Bangladesh Bank roughly $16 million in damages, though by that point, nearly 8 years had passed since the original theft, and the ruling covered only a portion of the total amount that had passed through the bank's Manila branch. Much of the remaining money, laundered through casino chips and further transfers, has never been recovered and is presumed effectively lost for good. U.S. investigators, including the FBI, along with cybersecurity firms that studied the malware used in the attack, publicly attributed the Bangladesh bank heist to a hacking group widely known as the Lazarus Group, which multiple governments and private security researchers have linked to North Korea. The technical fingerprints of the malware used, specific code patterns and infrastructure, were later connected by researchers to other major cyber incidents attributed to the same group, including a high-profile attack on a major film studio and a global ransomware outbreak. North Korea has consistently denied any involvement in the Bangladesh bank heist or any of the other incidents attributed to Lazarus Group. Department of Justice charged a North Korean computer programmer in connection with the heist and related cyber attacks, though, as with most state-linked cybercrime cases, no meaningful prosecution or extradition has followed, given the lack of any formal relationship between the countries involved. The Bangladesh bank heist wasn't an isolated incident for the group blamed for it, either. Investigators have since connected the same malware fingerprints and infrastructure to a wave of attempted attacks on dozens of other banks across Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the years around 2016, most far less successful than the Bangladesh operation, suggesting this was closer to a systematic, repeated campaign targeting the global banking system's messaging infrastructure than a single one-off theft. The heist forced a significant reckoning for SWIFT itself, the messaging network at the center of the entire incident. In the aftermath, SWIFT launched a customer security program, introducing mandatory security controls and regular compliance audits for the thousands of banks around the world that rely on its network, and began requiring member institutions to attest annually that they'd implemented baseline protections against exactly the kind of credential theft and internal network compromise that had enabled the Bangladesh bank attack. It was, in effect, an acknowledgement that the trust underpinning the entire system, the assumption that a message coming through SWIFT could be relied upon simply because it arrived through SWIFT, needed real technical verification behind it, not just institutional goodwill. It's worth dwelling for a moment on just how deliberately engineered the timing of this attack was, because it points to a broader vulnerability in how international finance operates across time zones. Bangladesh's weekend falls on Friday and Saturday, while most of the Western financial world treats Friday as a normal business day and observes the weekend on Saturday and Sunday instead. That one-day offset meant there was a narrow but real window, Thursday night and Friday in Bangladesh, during which Bangladesh Bank's own staff were away from their desks, unable to quickly notice or respond to unusual activity, while the Federal Reserve in New York and intermediary banks elsewhere were still fully staffed and processing transactions normally. The attackers appear to have specifically exploited this mismatch, and in the years since, several international banking security reviews have flagged the same kind of weekend and holiday time zone gaps as a recurring soft spot other financial institutions should specifically account for in their own incident response planning. To understand the scale of what Bangladesh Bank was up against, it helps to see the attack in the context of everything else the same group has since been linked to. Lazarus Group, according to Western intelligence agencies and private security researchers who have tracked its activity for years, has also been blamed for the 2014 hack of a major American film studio, an attack that resulted in the leak of unreleased films, executive emails, and employee personal data, reportedly in retaliation for a comedy film mocking North Korea's leadership. The same group has been linked to the WannaCry ransomware outbreak of 2017, which crippled parts of the UK's National Health Service and spread to hundreds of thousands of computers across more than 150 countries. More recently, researchers have tied Lazarus Group to some of the largest cryptocurrency heists in history, including a theft of over $600 million in digital assets from a blockchain gaming network in 2022. Seen against that broader pattern, the Bangladesh bank heist looks less like an isolated, opportunistic crime and more like one entry in a sustained, years-long campaign by a state-linked group treating financial theft as a legitimate tool of national policy, a use of offensive hacking capability that most other governments, publicly at least, have avoided deploying so directly and repeatedly for straightforward theft. The Bangladesh bank heist is a genuinely unusual entry in cybersecurity history because it blurs a line most people assume is fixed, that hacking and old-fashioned bank robbery are different categories of crime. This was functionally a bank robbery, conducted almost entirely through patient reconnaissance, stolen credentials, and a well-timed set of fraudulent instructions, with a laundering operation on the back end that could have come straight out of a heist movie, chips and all. It's also a story about how much modern global finance runs on trust and a messaging system most people have never heard of. and how a single point of weakness, one bank's compromised terminal, could nearly siphon the equivalent of a small nation's reserves out through a chain of institutions that had no reason to doubt the instructions they were receiving, because the instructions looked exactly like the real thing. Next time, we head from a central bank vault to a big box retail chain for the story of how a stolen password from an air conditioning company brought down 40 million credit cards during the busy